Hi. Good evening, guys.
Good evening, ma'am.
Yeah, we will discuss common mistakes made in English and try and see what we can do to improve the way we communicate our ideas. We'll start with the commonest mistakes that are made, and in the subsequent classes we will discuss more of such mistakes so that you fine-tune your linguistic abilities. To start with, the most common mistakes that we find around us are Indianisms. What we mean by Indianisms is that there are a few people who use expressions which you see are used only in India. It is not used by the native speakers of the language. For example, we hear a lot of educated people in India also using a word like timings. So we talk about office timings, school timings, clinic timings, etc. Not realizing the fact that there is no word like timings in English. We are rather supposed to say, for example, office hours, clinic hours, school hours, etc. I hope you understood that.
Yeah, ma'am, perfect.
Okay, then going on to the next one, this is again a very common expression that you hear around again it happens with educated people. So we do come across people who say that they're not able to cope up with a problem. Again, cope up with is so specific to India. Native speakers don't use this expression. What they rather use is cope with. So if you're finding something pretty difficult beyond your level, so that's when you say you're not able to cope with the problem, not cope up with the problem. And just a moment. Then the next one again, give an exam. We hear a lot of people saying this, right? So why this happens is people tend to think in a particular language and speak in another language. In fact, the fifth point is again about the same thing, transliterations, wherein people think in their local language and then carry over the same style of speaking or the same way of expressing ideas in a language like English. So in Hindi, for example, you say you give an exam, but in English you don't give an exam, you take an exam. You do have an expression like give an exam in English, but that has a pretty different meaning. If you're the examiner, if you're conducting an exam, then that is basically if you're on the other side of the bench, that is when you would say you're going to give an exam. Whereas when you're a student, you don't give an exam, you take an exam, or you can say you appear for an exam, you sit for an exam. That's how you're supposed to put it across. You don't even say you write an exam. That's also a common mistake that we hear around us. Okay? Because yes, in many of the vernacular languages, we say we write an exam, but in English you don't write an exam, you just take an exam. And another very common mistake that's made is people talk about how their child is the first ranker or the second ranker, etc. The word ranker is actually used in the military circles to refer to a person who is a ranking officer. So if someone has secured a top rank in an exam, you're supposed to refer to him as a rank holder, or you can call him a topper but not a ranker. Right? So you're supposed to say first rank holder, second rank holder, etc. There's no word like ranker in the context that many of us in India use. Okay. And another very common mistake is you hear people saying when you introduce yourself or if they haven't really managed to remember your name, they ask you, may I know your good name please? Again, people tend to think in one language and speak in another language. In English, good name is an expression which has a totally different meaning. It means reputation, right? So, of course, in the very first meeting, you don't ask a person about his or her reputation. So, if you want to sound polite, you could actually just say, may I know your name, please? Not, can you give me your good name? Right? So, that is to be avoided. So, good name is good reputation, bad name is bad reputation. So, in English, every name is just a name. Right, so we are not supposed to prefix an adjective to it. And another very common case where mistakes are made is, for example, again this is specific to India. This is again a vernacular style. So if I say in the very first meeting itself, or in the very first sentence, in the first sentence itself, in the first meeting itself, itself is not to be used in this part of the sentence. We are rather supposed to say in the very first sentence, this is what he said, or you could say in the very first meeting, this is what she said. So very first is how native speakers would talk about it. They wouldn't say first meeting itself or second meeting itself, etc. And Another very common mistake that we find in India is we use the word only at the end of the sentence. Right? Again, this is a style that you see only in India. Native speakers don't put it across this way. So you hear people saying, he is like that only, this place is like this only, etc. How would native speakers talk about it? Any idea?
Ma'am, no.
Okay. So native speakers would rather say, this is how he is. This is how this place is. We just need to accept it the way it is. That is how they would talk about it. They wouldn't use only at the, they wouldn't use only dangling at the end of the sentence like that. And this is another league of mistakes that we find in India. People say comprise of, and again you hear a lot of educated people making this kind of mistake. Comprise actually means consist of. Right? So in effect I'm actually using to of here when I say comprise of. So it's like consist of. So instead, you would just use the word comprise by itself. So for example, you would say, this book comprises these chapters, or you would say that today's class will comprise these elements that are to be discussed, etc. That's how we are supposed to use it in a sentence. Likewise, the word discuss actually means talk about. So for example, you would say, oh, we discussed these issues yesterday, which would actually mean that we talked about these issues yesterday. So there's no need to say we discussed about, which is actually like talked about. However, a point to note here is that if I use the word discuss as a noun, for example, if I say we had a discussion, then I can use the word about here. So I can say we had a discussion about these issues. Likewise, you could say, an emphasis was placed on these issues. But you cannot say we emphasized on these issues. That is, basically as a verb, we don't use it with a preposition, but if you use the same word as a noun, you can use it with a preposition. So you can say an emphasis was placed on these issues, but you can't say these issues were emphasized on. That would be bad English. Right? And another very common mistake is you find a lot of people saying one of my friend. That's wrong. Whenever you say one of, it has to be, the following noun has to be a plural noun. So we need to say one of my friends, and the next verb has to be is. One of my friends is, not are. So actually you're referring to one friend out of a group of friends. That's the basic idea there. So that also makes for a lot of mistakes. And the third point is the most interesting. You see, the word only is placed in the wrong part of the sentence many times. So there was, I believe, once this guy who wrote a letter to his boss saying that as my wife is down with high fever and as I'm her only husband at home, I may be granted leave. So that is a terrible mistake to make, of course. Right? And you'll notice that how you position the word only in a sentence will largely determine what meaning you wish to convey. For example, if I say, only children are allowed to play in the swimming pool in the afternoon. Right? Now here, only children would mean that nobody else is allowed to play. If I say, children are allowed to only play in the swimming pool in the afternoon, which means that they are only allowed to play, they are not allowed to do anything else in the swimming pool. So it changes the meaning again. And if I say children are allowed to play only in the swimming pool in the afternoon, which means they're not supposed to play anywhere else, they should be only in the swimming pool. So that again gives you a totally different meaning. And to bring about another twist, if I say children are allowed to play in the swimming pool only in the afternoon, now this specifies the time period, that they're supposed to play only in the afternoon but not at any other time of the day. The sentence and end up miscommunicating. And the fourth point is take care of the position of the words that describe a part of the sentence. I'll just probably explain this with an example. There was once this guy again who went to his village and came back to his office with this to say. Since he was telling his colleagues that I went to my village yesterday to sell my land along with my wife. Right now that was terrible. Along with my wife would mean that he sold his wife as well, but that's not what he wanted to convey. Now, along with my wife is what we call a group of words intended to describe a part of the sentence. Obviously, it is supposed to describe whom he went with. So he should say, I, along with my wife, went to my village to sell my land. That would have conveyed the right meaning, right? So that's again a very common mistake. Many of us end up making such mistakes without having the slightest iota of feeling about the fact that we've probably communicated the wrong idea. And yes, the fifth one is avoid transliterations. This is what we talked about just a while back, like give an exam, good name, etc. are instances of thinking in a language and communicating in another language. Some more examples of transliterations would be, for example, when people say she's a small girl, she doesn't know anything. So, for example, in Hindi or in any other Indian language, you say something like small girl, but in English you're supposed to say little girl. Or to take another example, in Hindi you say, for example, tez barish. In English you don't say fast rain, you say there's a heavy rain. Okay. So there is a certain way of communicating that is unique to every language, and again, English has its own unique style of communicating ideas. So please ensure that you do not think in some other language and then communicate in English. That also makes for a lot of errors. Another mistake that I wanted to discuss with you is many people end up confusing these words. Where do I use habit? Where should I use custom? For example, can I say drinking coffee is an English habit? Any idea?
Probably yes. Generally, we use in our day-to-day life that drinking coffee is my habit.
Yes, so that gives you a hint of the fact that the word habit is something that's more used in more of contexts that are personal in nature. So if I'm talking about my own individual ways of doing things, that's when I would use the word habit. Whereas when I'm talking about something about the whole society, as you rightly pointed out, it should be more of this word, custom. Right? So if I'm talking about drinking coffee or drinking tea for the whole society, then I would say it's an English custom, not a habit. For example, and another thing you would notice is that habit is more out of personal choice. So I would say, for example, that he has made it a habit to come late to the office. Right? You wouldn't say he's made it a custom to come late to the office. Right? So you notice that habit is more to do with things that we do out of personal choice, whereas custom is something that's handed down from one generation to another generation in a society. So that would be the more appropriate word to use.
Okay.
Now let's go to the next one, which is how should you appear more confident when you speak to people. Now, a very common mistake that we Indians make is that, that again brings me to another point. I hear a lot of people saying, I did a mistake. No, you don't do a mistake in English, you make a mistake. Right? So how do we appear more confident? A common mistake that we make is we rush into what we say. We speak too fast. Right? And we Indians are notorious for our pace of speech. We speak so fast that for non-native speakers, it's very difficult to follow what we are saying. Right? Now, speaking at a moderate pace has its own advantages, and it gives you multiple benefits. One is you have more time to think about what you say. That's what I've pronounce your words slowly and clearly. That is where you need to stress the right part of the word. For example, when I say something like palpitation is heartbeat, for example, especially when you're tense. So the stress is on the second last syllable there. So we say palpitation, whereas what most of us Indians would do is we would just say palpitation. We say the whole word at the same speed, without any stress on a particular part of the word. So that's where we miss out on how much we can make our speech intelligible to the other person. Intelligible is an understandable. Right? So what we say would be much easier to understand for the listener if we were to articulate, that is, pronounce our words slowly and clearly, laying the stress at the right part of the word and laying the stress on the right word itself when it comes as part of a sentence. Okay. And that would also probably eliminate room for mispronunciation. And the third point is, yes, you need to pause at the right points. For example, when there is one particular group of words which convey one idea, and when you go to the next group of words which convey another idea, we need to give a pause in between. And when we don't do that, what we say would not be intelligible to the listener, and we would also lose track of what we say. So sometimes, and when we lose track of what we say, when we forget what we wanted to say, that also makes us appear nervous. Right? So we need to pause at the right points, and you need to speak at a pace which will allow yourself some time to think in the background. Right? So there has to be two parallel activities that are going on. When you speak, you should speak at a pace at which you allow yourself to think in the background, so that you know what is the next thing to say. And in fact, when we are struggling with communication, initially you might want to do a lot of it. Right? Think a lot in the background and then speak, so that you appear much more confident. And you might also, in fact, want to rehearse what you say right at the back of your mind. So all this, of course, comes with practice. It's not rocket science. And the next point also helps a lot, right? So if you have a particular pattern of thought, as in if you have a neat chart of ideas on your mind, that is, this idea should gradually lead on to the next idea and then to the next idea and so on. So if you have a neat sequence of thought that you've chalked out for yourself, that will also help you appear a lot more confident, right, about what you want to say. And yes, speak at a pace that allows you to breathe comfortably. This is, in fact, the most important point, although I've put it at the last part of the slide, because if you don't allow yourself to breathe comfortably, you will appear very nervous. Okay? So do make sure that you pause at the right moments, so that you speak at the right pace. And then let's go to the next one. How do you have an interesting conversation? One thing is, yes, don't try to be what you're not. People love you for what you are, whether you believe it or not. Right? So you just be whom you are, and imagine you're talking to someone who likes you. Imagine you're talking to someone who is known to you. Do not, really get this idea into your mind that the person you're going to talk to is a complete stranger. Because once that idea becomes deep-seated in your mind, then you become very nervous. Right? And when you become nervous, you make yourself less likable, if I can put it that way. So just try to be what you're not. Don't appear egoistic, as in don't assume that you know a lot more than the others. People do not like people who are egoistic. The most liked people you will see, in fact, are the ones who are extremely humble, even if they happen to be very accomplished. Right? So when you assume that you're talking to a friend, it always works, right? People would be able to connect with you a lot more easily. And the moment people will connect with you, you establish a comfortable rapport with the listener, and that will make sure that you have a smooth go at the conversation. And the third point is, yes, many of us make this mistake. Of course, I'm also doing it now. I'm talking much more and not listening to you much, yes, but in a conversation, definitely you should make sure that you listen at least 60% of the time, and you talk for only about 40% of the time. So people love it when you listen to them. Right? So when you listen, of course, there's another advantage as well, because when you listen to the person, you would also be thinking of what you would like to say next, and that makes you again more appealing to the other person. Okay. And yes, never ever use offensive language. Now, offensive language does not just mean using bad words. It could also mean using words that put the other person down. So if I say, for example, listen, I want you to hear this. Now, that sounds like, I am offending the other person's ego in a way. And so for me, at least I believe that even that counts as offensive language. So if I can just put it in the form of a request, the other person will obviously feel obliged to listen to us. Right? So I would say, could I request you to listen to just this one point? Could you spare a couple of minutes of your time? That way of speaking always appeals to the other person. And whether you believe in it or not, when you put a smile in your voice, it shows. Even if you're talking on the phone, the other person would be able to feel that there is a smile in your voice, and that's infectious. That carries over to the other person as well, and the other person also sounds cheerful and optimistic. Right? So there's a lot of that positive atmosphere that's created, and positivity builds on positivity. Right? So that's where it gives you successful results, right? So please ensure that you put a smile in your voice when you have a conversation with a person, face to face or on phone. Ensure that you appear cheerful, and you should also always sound empathetic. The moment you disconnect with the person who is speaking to you, then there's no room for the conversation to go further. So you should be able to understand exactly what the other person is going through, how you would feel if you were in that person's shoes. That would also help you say the right thing without you making an artificial effort to do so, and it would also make you more appealing to the other person again. And the next one is start with the most relevant point. Sometimes we do too much of beating around the bush, right? So, for example, there are people who start the conversation with the talk about the weather, the climate, politics, etc. Ensure that you gauge the interest levels of the other person, where that person's area of interest lies. In fact, why did you, in fact, start a conversation with that person? What is the most important thing you want to say? So sometimes it helps to come straight to the point instead of beating around the bush. That way you'll be able to catch the attention of the other person and get the conversation going. And yes, of course, later on in the course of the conversation, if you have scope for further discussion, you can go on and on with what you wanted to say or what you probably did not even plan to talk about. Right. So with that, we will end today's session.